So we, when we were growing up, I was about maybe at 10 or 11 years old at that time, and maybe even younger than that, maybe 7 or 8 years old. And there were my grandfather used to be alive at that time, and he lived there. And so my cousins, I believe there were 3 other cousins, and I had we were 3 brothers at the time, no sisters. So we were all together in the house, and my grandfather, in his wisdom, decided to buy us these little guns, which had little cork in the front, and I don't know how many of you must have seen those. So you pull the trigger and the cork will fly. It was tied with a little string. So my cousin, who has now passed away, but he was about my age. So he goes to the neighbor lady, and must have been doing some mischief, and she scolded him. And in those days, at least in our neighborhood, you could do anything you wanted to do, but there was somebody watching you. The family was one, but then you also had neighbors, and you had other people who were like they're your uncles and aunts, and they were like your guardians. So this lady scolded my cousin, and he must have felt it bad, and he comes home crying. And so everybody, all of us asked him, what happened to you? And he says, this lady next door, she scolded me or something. So we had just acquired these guns, and so we all 5 or 6 of us, we all picked up our guns, and we show up in our front yard. and this lady, she thought these were real guns, and she ran inside screaming, and we thought we had accomplished our goal, now by then nobody had to fire anything, and we came home. So that was one which I very interestingly remember by now, even after so many years. The other was, my father was a physician, but he was just trying to establish at that time. He wasn't really, he was just new in practice. And my parents had lived in Iran, and at the time of partition, although they were from India, but they lived in Iran, and then they came back because of Mossadegh's time and all that. When they came to Pakistan, so my father had established a civil practice and so on, and so all he could afford at that time was a bicycle. And so we used to see Dad go on the bike to his practice and then come home and so on. Then we saw that he graduated a little bit from that bike, and he bought a horse and a cart. We used to call it tangas. Tangas. I don't know if how many of you know. The kids may not know. We call it tanga. So there's a horse in the front, and basically horse carriage. Yeah. And then after a couple of years, he graduated from that, and then he decided to buy a car. And he never learned how to drive a car, but he hired a chauffeur. And it was an old car. It was a British Vauxhall. I don't know if you remember, Vauxhall was a old British car. And but the car was, from the very get-go, from the first day the car came, it was a bad luck car. So the first day the car came to the house, and my little brother, who was, I think, about 3 or 4 years old, he had his hand there, and somebody slammed the door on his fingers. Poor kid, his fingers got smashed. And so we knew there was something wrong with the car. So anyway, a few days passed, and we are traveling from Lahore to a place called Sargodha, where we lived. And on the way, and this is like my uncle was driving, and in the middle of the night, it's all dark and we can't even see anything. There were no street lights or nothing. And of course, we are out in the wilderness, and the car broke down. And so this chauffeur, he was also sitting right next to my uncle. My uncle was driving, but the chauffeur was sitting there. My mom and dad and 3 or 4 kids in the back seat. We are all there. So the driver, this chauffeur says, I'll go look for some help here. So he goes, and he goes to this place, and the total strangers. Times were different at that time. People are not like now. There was people were willing to help and so on. So he goes into this house. This happens to be a very rich man, and he says, "Oh, your car is broken. Why don't you just? There's no driver. There's no workshop open at this time. So why don't you just all come in, and we will keep you here." So, and it was. They kept us in the house, they fed us all. I remember still, it was kind of nice. And the next morning, the car got fixed, and finally we got home. And the last thing that happened with this funny car was my father wanted to open another clinic, a better place where he could practice, and he would have his own dispensary and his own all that. So, as it turns out, and he invited, I don't know how many of you remember Maulana Hafiz Kifayat Hussain Sahab Qibla, Marhum, I don't know. He was one of those, really the icon, like Mufti Jafar Hussain, you heard about, he was at the same level at that time. He was invited to give a speech and open this clinic. So we all went to the rail station, and we sit in the car, and the car refuses to get started. So the driver is cranking, cranking, and nothing happens. So he says, he turns to my dad, he says, "Dr. Saab, we have to push the car to get it started." So, would you know, Hafiz Kifayat Hussain, as senior as he was, and he was an older man. He says, "Dr. Saab, don't worry, I'm also here with you, and I will push the car." So we are all the kids, and my father and Hafiz Saab, we all pushed that car, and lo and behold, the car started. So that's how we got home. And so this was, everybody in the family would say, "I think you should get rid of this car. This car is a bad news all around, right from the very first day." That's all I have to say. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.